So in today's session, we are going to start with the clinical project. So before we ahead with the clinical project, let us discuss about what is the role of a SAS programmer in clinical industry. So before going to that, so why we always call a clinical SAS programmer? So there is nothing such clinical SAS programming or financial SAS programming. So SAS programming is just one programming and it's unique, like SAS programming when it comes to the technical aspects. But why do we always say as clinical SAS programming and financial SAS programming as in? So when we want to work SAS programming, when we have to use in clinical industry, along with SAS programming, we also have to integrate the standards that need to be followed to process the data. And when it comes to the other domains, I mean, other than the clinical, say like financial domain, or it could be the government sector, or say like insurance, or in any other pharma sector. I mean, pharma sector as in terms of life insurance or health insurance. Okay, we can say. So when it comes to the other industries, as there is no particular standard that to be followed, only the technical skills itself, like base and advanced programming itself, will be sufficient. The usage of SAS programming, how it is different from clinical to the other sectors, as in, so let me take a small example. We'll take a small example in terms of banking domain. A very small example for banking domain is, suppose say that, okay, let me use my notepad. Okay. So suppose say when it comes to banking domain, say we have a data that to be processed using SAS programming. Say we have the customer data, okay, a simple customer data with debit and credit, okay. Right. So customer ID, debit and credit. This is the data, and with a certain amount of records we have got. Now, when it comes to the banking domains, it is not necessary for any banking domain to stick to a specific terminology. Suppose say you are working for bank one, okay, so where you have received the data as customer ID, debit, credit, right? And suppose say you are handling now another bank project when you are working for a service-based company, say bank two. So there you have received the data as ID, okay, say deposit and withdrawal, okay. Now, so for any, when it comes to a bank or when it comes to any other domains except clinical, it is not necessary that they have to follow a specific terminology or a standard terminology, okay, since they no need to submit the data to any regulatories for approval purposes. Hence, they can follow any terminology of their choices, right? So here see, customer debit credit or ID deposit withdrawal. It's the same, isn't it? The meaning is not different. But when it comes to the clinical domain, that is not the case. I mean, clinical projects, that is not the case. So whatever data that we receive from a clinical domain or from a clinical sector, it need to be submitted to the regulatories. Okay. So for approval purposes, so there will be different kinds of approval and different kinds of reviews that we will be discussing as part of the clinical project. But whatever the clinical data that we always use, it should be submitted to the regulatory for review and approval purposes. So hence, there should be a standard that need to be followed while processing the clinical data. So that is, for suppose say, there is a pharma company, okay, say like Pharma 1. So you have received the data from a pharma company called say Pharma 1, for example. So say there you have received the data as patient ID, okay, their date of birth, right? And for example, say, let us stick to patient ID and date of birth for now, okay? We'll keep it as simple as possible since it is the very first session, right? And now suppose say you have received, when you're working for a service-based company, not necessary that you will be asked to be working only for one project, so once you are done with one project, maybe you will be asked to shift to another project. So that is how the work rotates in a service based companies. Okay. Now, for example, say you are working for another company. I mean, you are working for another company project, say Pharma 2, for example. So where you have received the data as subject ID, okay, and birth date, right? Now, whatever data that we have received for a clinical project, it should be submitted to the regulatories for review and approval purposes. And whatever this naming convention that's been used internally by the companies, with the same naming convention, it should not be submitted to the regulatories. Okay. So now, so why it should not be submitted as in think? It's not with one or two pharma companies, isn't it? So there are thousands of pharma companies who does lot of clinical research, and each and every pharma company has to submit the data to their concerned regulatories, right? So now it will be pressure on I mean, it will be pressure on the regulatories, isn't it? So suppose say there are 100 pharma companies, okay, they have to submit all their project data or all their research data to a regulatory. Now all the companies are using their own terminologies. For example, now, if there is no unique standard that to be followed, then it will be pressure on the regulatories to understand first what are the internal, I mean, to understand the each organization internal terminology, and then they have to understand the data, and then they have to review it, and then it should be sent for the approval purposes. So it's like lot of time consuming work, and at the same time it's like a lot of pressure on the regulatories too. So hence, what being suggested by the regulatory is, so the organizations uh, that has to submit the data to the regulatories, so before the data go for the submission, it should be standardized and it should be organized following a unique standard. So then it will be, I mean, as the unique terminology being followed by all the organizations, it will be easy for regulatories to go through the data for review, I mean, for review purposes and as well as for the approval purposes. So, for example, how it gets standardized as in, so one of the most popularly used standard that's been recommended by the regulatories is CDISC. Okay, I'm not saying this is the only standard, but this is the most popular standard. Like more than 180 or 200 countries recommended this standard. So that is why it has become one of the most popular standard that's been used in the clinical projects. But otherwise, there are some other standards too existing. Okay. But as it is the most popular standard, we will be learning about this standard in detail when we start the clinical project. Okay. Now, so as per the CDISC standard, okay, suppose say this patient ID and date of birth data by pharma company 1 should be submitted to the regulatory, okay, and the same subject and date of birth data by pharma 2 company also should be submitted to the regulatory, right? So before it gets submitted, how the naming convention should be changed as in with respect to CDISC standard, okay? So when the CDISC standard is followed by the organizations, that patient ID, okay, should be that patient ID data should be submitted as the data will not be changing. The data will remain same. Okay, only the naming convention will be changing. So patient ID, generally we call it as U subject ID. Okay, it will be equal to this. Okay, and date of birth will be submitted as like this. In the same way, when the pharma company, pharma 2, has to submit the data, the naming convention should be changed to this. Okay, got it? Okay. So now, with this terminology, the data will be submitted to the regulatory. Okay. So the naming conventions, okay, the naming conventions or the terminologies will remain same. So whoever have to submit the data to the regulatory, the naming conventions will be same. So now it will be easy on the regulatories to understand the data that is submitted by different organizations, isn't it? So the data will be different because as the people participating into that research and the data that gets collected for each research will be unique. The data will be unique, but the name, as the naming conventions remain same, it will be easy for the regulatories to go through it, and that actually reduces the time consumption. Okay, so that is why when it comes to the SAS programming, the programming skills or the technical skills what we use either in clinical projects or for the other projects, like I said, for banking projects or for any government data processing or for any insurance data processing, the technical skills always remain same. So technical skills, I mean to say here, like the programming what we learn as part of base programming or the programming what we learn as part of advanced programming, that always remains same. Okay, so there will be no difference in the skills that what we use. So the only difference is when you're working in a clinical project along with base and advanced programming, as we have to integrate this particular standard called CDISC. Actually, we always say CDISC standards, right? So CDISC is not a standard. CDISC is an organization which has developed several standards in order to keep the clinical research projects data and the clinical research projects workflow in a systematic way and in a more organized way. Okay, so CDISC is an organization which has developed several standards. We will be learning about all that standards, and as a SAS programmers, what are the standards that are unique, I mean, that are important for us? We will be learning in detail. Okay. So when we discuss the clinical project steps, we will be going through different standards that's been developed by this organization. Okay, and we will be discussing briefly about the standards that are out of our work, and we will be discussing the standards that's been developed by this organization in detail, that are I mean, that we use as part of our work. Okay. Yep. So this is the main difference between working when a SAS programmer has to work in clinical industry to the other industries. Okay. So when it comes to the other industries, as there is no particular standard that to be followed, only the technical skills itself, like base and advanced programming itself, will be sufficient. When you have to work for clinical, along with that, you also have to learn the standard called CDISC. Okay. Now let us start with role of a SAS programmer in clinical project. Okay. So as a SAS programmer, what work we will be doing in a clinical project, I'll tell you, right? And then we'll talk about the clinical project steps in detail before we get into the technical part in the project. Okay. So here is the document that we have got. I'll be sharing this document with you. Okay, so you no need to take any kind of notes when the session is happening. So just focus on the session, and if you have any questions, make sure you note down all the questions. Okay, and once we are done with the session, maybe in the last 5-10 minutes or 15 minutes, we can spare for your doubts. Okay, since it is the theory part, so sometimes most of the questions whatever you note down when the session is happening, so most of the questions will be answered by the end of the session. Okay, and still if there are any questions that are left, then we can discuss all that questions once we are done with that session. Okay. Right. Coming to the role of a SAS programmer in clinical industry. So as a SAS programmer, okay, we are responsible. We are responsible for processing the clinical trial study data. Okay. So now here clinical trial, that is a new term for us. So clinical trial is nothing but as part of the clinical project, we will be working on clinical trial data. Okay. So as we will be working on the clinical trial data, it is important for us to have a good knowledge about what is a clinical trial. Okay, and what is a clinical trial process? So that we will be discussing in detail again. Okay, so processing the clinical trial study data. So how it should be processed? Technical applications, SAS programming. Okay, we'll be using SAS programming, technical specification, and we have to use CDISC, CDISC organization developed standard. Okay, CDISC organization developed, CDISC organization developed a standard called SDTM standard. Okay, in order to process the clinical trial study data, we require SAS programming knowledge. Well, and one of the standard called SDTM, which is developed by CDISC organization. So using this standard and the SAS application, we will be processing the clinical trial study data. So that is our first responsibility. Coming to that, coming to the next one. So once we have processed the clinical trial study data, so is the study data itself will be sufficient? Does it yield any results? No, right? So some kind of analysis work should be done with the study data, okay, which we call it as like data analytics. Okay, so some kind of analysis work need to be done with the study data. So in order to do that analysis work, whatever the analysis data sets to be developed, whatever analysis, so developing analysis data sets. So that analysis data sets should be developed again using SAS programming and following one of the CDISC organization developed standard called ADaMs. Okay, called ADaMs. So once the analysis data sets been developed with the help of a statistician, we will be running different analysis procedures in SAS, and some kind of results will be produced, and statistician will be going through that results, and he'll produce a very good insights about the results. Okay, and there will be another team, and the results whatever been interpreted by the statistician, okay, will be used in order to develop a report called CSR report. Okay, so anyways, that is not part of our work. Clinical study report will be developed. So, and what is next our work as in? Okay, so study data being processed, and using the study data in order to run the analysis, whatever analysis data sets to be developed, we have developed. Now, the final stage will be, in our work, reporting. So that reporting, we always call it as TLF. Okay, so TLFs is nothing but table, listing, figure or graph, both are same. Table, listing and figures. Now, as per the analysis requirement, whatever reports that needs to be done, okay, so the templates will be provided to us. Templates as in, you can say in a way like mock shell or model report. Okay, the model report will be given to us, and as per the model report, using the study data, okay, or using the analysis data sets, we will be developing a report called TLFs. Okay, so this is the role of a SAS programmer in clinical industry. Processing the clinical trial study data, developing the analysis data sets, and doing the reports, like doing TLFs, tables, listings, and figures. Okay. Now, so for processing the clinical trial study data and for development of the analysis data sets, we have to follow the standards that's been developed by the CDISC organization called SDTM and ADaMs. Okay. So in detail, as part of, as a SAS programmer in clinical project, when you're working for a clinical project, these are the different kinds of work we are responsible to handle. It is not that, again, it is not that only one SAS programmer will be doing all this. As a team, the work will be split, and so whatever you will be asked to do, all the inputs in order to do that work, whatever inputs being required will be given to you, and accordingly you have to finish up your work. Okay, so So don't think that, I mean, when we see, like, we feel like it's like a huge lot of work, but don't feel that, only one programmer will be handling it. So there will be definitely hierarchy followed, isn't it? Like there will be a project lead, and then there will be teams for doing SDTM, for doing ADaM, and for doing TLFs. Okay. And for each team, there will be a team lead. There will be the senior programmers. There will be, intermediate level programmer. There will be the junior programmers. Okay. So, and there will be the biostatistician. Okay. Again, senior principal statistical programmer, and then, statistical programmer. The one, I mean, you can say like statisticians, the one who are with, who are titled as statisticians. Okay. So they work as like principal statistical programmer, and then statistical programmer. Okay. So there will be like different teams. There will be a lot of people working in that project, right? But anyways, in detail, like, I mean, as a whole, as a SAS programmers team, what all work will be done as in, this is the work. Now, in order to do each work, what kind of inputs do we require? Okay. And from where do we get all that input? What all the different, it's not that only SAS programmers team involved in a clinical trial project. There will be several teams, and there will be like lot of people, hundreds of people who will be involved in this project. Okay. So let us talk about all that steps so that we'll get an idea. Like when we have a good idea about the complete project flow, it will be easy for us to understand, from where we are getting the inputs, and from that inputs we deliver some kind of outputs, isn't it? And that outputs will be handled by whom? Okay, in order to do the next step of work. So when you're clear of all this, it will be easy for us to know what we are doing. When you know what you are doing, it will be, it will give you always a very clear idea of the entire project, and you will not be kept in a, I mean, you will not be in a blind spot basically. So that is always important when you're working as part of the team. Okay. Yeah. So now let us start with clinical trial process. So why clinical trial process? I told because we will be working with the clinical trial study data. So what is a clinical trial? It is always good to know what is a clinical trial, isn't it? So let us talk about the clinical trial process. Coming to the clinical trial process, we call this clinical trial process as drug development process. Okay. So drug is nothing but, we all know, right? Like, for example, say, the medicines that are available at the pharmacy store, right? All this we call it as drug, isn't it? Okay. So drug development process. So why drug development process? As in, definitely for quality of life, isn't it? In order to improve the quality of life, there should be always, the new drugs should keep coming up, and not necessarily drugs only, like new therapies, isn't it? New medical devices, new testing procedures, everything has to keep growing in order to improve someone's life, isn't it? So that is the main reason for drug development. Okay. Now, so in how many phases the drug development will happen? And in this document, mostly I have listed, I have used US clinical research. Okay, so usually in US clinical research, all the research data should be submitted to the regulatory called FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So why I have used US as an example here is, US is one of the country where they do like a lot of clinical research. Okay, so that is the reason. And again, in European countries also, the clinical research happen very widely. Okay, like, and when it comes to European countries, it's like EMAs are the regulatories, European medical agencies. Okay, all the clinical research data should be submitted to the European medical agencies, and they have to review the data, and they should approve in order to launch the drug into the market. Okay, I mean, to make it commercially available. Okay. But as I said, like as US is one of the most popular and clinical research happen widely there, I have used US as the example here in this document. But don't think that US is the only country. There are several, even in India today, in India too, like there are a lot of clinical research been happening, and all when it comes to Indian market, it is DCGI, I guess, if I'm not wrong, the regulatory. Okay, yeah. Now, so in how many phases the clinical trial happen as in preclinical studies? Phase 1, 2, 3, 4, as I mentioned here. What is preclinical studies? Preclinical studies is nothing but when the new drug formula is developed. So that new drug formula will be tested on animals. So that we call it as preclinical studies. Here I explained in detail what is preclinical studies. Which we call it as animal clinical studies. So once that animal clinical studies is proven safe, so then the drug will be moving to the next step, which is nothing but human clinical trials. Okay, human clinical trials. So for we will not be working on the preclinical studies data. Okay, so here I just have provided preclinical studies. Uh, you know, to understand each and every step in the continuous flow. That's all. Okay. So preclinical studies is nothing but animal clinical studies. So once it is proven safe, then the human clinical trial starts. In human clinical trials, these all the phases will come up. Okay, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let us talk about phase 1. So coming to the phase 1 is like first in human, you can say. So as it is the very first time that a newly developed drug or the formula is being tested, safety is the only parameter that will be monitored here in phase 1. Okay. So the whole idea for doing phase 1 is definitely monitoring the safety of the drug. So to whoever the drug is given, okay, they will be monitored, their safety will be monitored here in this case. And it's not like too many people will be involved, maybe like 10, 20 or 30. They will not go beyond it. Okay, because the risk will be very high, isn't it, in phase 1, as it is the first time that a new formula is being tested on humans. Although it is proven safe on animals, it's not that the animal and human, you know, you cannot compare, isn't it? So that's the reason. And once phase 1 clinical trials is approved by regulatory, okay. So phase 1 clinical trial, all that research data should be submitted to the regulatory. And once the regulatory approves phase 1, so then phase 2 clinical trials can start. So coming to the phase 2, because in phase 1 safety is already approved, isn't it? So as in phase 1 safety is approved, now the risk being lowered, isn't it? As the risk is lowered, now more number of people can be involved in phase 2. So more number of people as in maybe like 100, 200, 300, not beyond that. Okay. So more as in it's not like in thousands, but in hundreds only it will be definitely. Now in phase 2, safety will be monitored, and at the same time, parallelly, efficacy also will be monitored. So efficacy is nothing but, for what purpose the drug being developed. Usually every drug will be developed for a purpose. For what purpose the drug is developed. So to what extent that purpose is being solved. Okay. So finding out that is nothing but efficacy. Efficacy is nothing but how efficient the drug is. Okay. For the purpose it is developed. That is nothing but efficacy. So all this phase 2 clinical research data should be submitted to the regulatory. And once regulatory gets convinced with this phase 2 results, phase 2 will be approved. Okay. So once phase 2 is approved, now the trial can move to the next step, which is phase 3. So coming to the phase 3, as both safety and efficacy will be approved in phase 2, right? As phase 2 results are nothing but both safety and efficacy. As both the parameters are approved, gets approved in phase 2, moving on to phase 3. Phase 3 now can be in larger scale. Larger scale as in definitely in thousands. Okay. Definitely in thousands. So phase 3 is like larger scale. Okay. So in phase 3 also same safety and efficacy parameters will be monitored. Okay. And once all this phase 3 data will be submitted to the regulatory, okay, and once the regulatory reviews the phase 3 results, okay, and if phase 3 gets approved, okay, so once phase 3 gets approved, now the drug is ready for commercial launch. Okay, the drug will be ready for commercial launch. Commercial launch, as in, you know, right, like the drug gets manufactured and it will be available in the nearby pharmacy stores. Okay, now, so once the drug is available in the nearby pharmacy stores, then phase 4 trials will start. So coming to the phase 4 trials, post marketing trials. Okay, post marketing trials, as in, so once the drug, so see, some of the drugs can be available on counter, isn't it? And some of the drugs will be like prescribed medications, isn't it? So now, however, when the drug is available in the market, in the initial stages, in the early stage, some kind of feedback or some kind of surveys will be conducted or done on the products, isn't it? So suppose say that once after using that product, maybe in short term or in long term, okay, after consuming that product, if there is any abnormality faced by the consumers, okay, whoever been using it, if the abnormalities are something which is life threatening, okay, so then the drug will be called back from the market, maybe for a revision, or it will be completely banned based upon the feedback and based upon the survey results. We keep hearing that in the real world, isn't it? So see, like for some time the drugs will be available in the market, right? And suppose say maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, if you go for the same drug, uh, you know, so sometimes, the drugs will be available. Otherwise, they'll say that the drug is not available anymore in the market. So what does that mean? It means that, the people who ever been consuming it for long term, maybe short term or long term, for a certain period of time, if there are any life threatening abnormalities, the regulators will always keep monitoring. It's not that, okay, the drug now been launched into the market, now it can be left like that. No, so the regulators will always keep an eye on the products that are live in the market. Okay, and they always keep an eye on the one whoever been consuming that product, how they are doing. Okay, so that is called quality of life, isn't it? So how they are doing, and if there is something wrong with that product, okay, so if it is giving any kind of long term life threatening issues, so then either the drug will be called back, I mean, it will be called back from the market definitely, maybe for a revision, or it will be banned. Okay, so that is phase 4 trials. That is why we always call phase 4 as post marketing trials. Okay, now, so in all the phases, mainly in phase 1, 2, 3, okay, we are saying that the clinical research data gets submitted to the regulatory, correct? So in order to reach that submission point, okay, what all the teams are involved, and what is the role of each team, and what kind of outputs are being generated by each team. So the outputs that are produced by one team will be used as the inputs by the other team, I mean by the following team, you can say. Okay, for suppose say that there is team 1, okay, whatever outputs that team 1 is producing, right? So team 2 will be using that outputs as the inputs. Okay, and team 2 will be producing some outputs. And now whatever outputs that's been produced by team 2 will be used as the inputs by team 3. Okay, hence we should know like what all the teams are involved and what kind of outputs are produced by each team, and how that outputs will be used as the inputs by the next team, I mean by the following team. Okay, right. So in all the 3 phases, okay, whatever workflow that we will be discussing in the following session, okay, so in all the 3 phases that workflow will be followed. Okay, in all the three phases. And remember, once phase 1 approved, then once phase 1 is approved by regulatory, then only we can move on to phase 2. Once phase 2 is approved by regulatory, then only we will be able to move to phase 3. Once phase 3 is approved, then only the product is legally permitted for its commercial production. Okay, I mean, which is nothing but like available to the common public. Okay, now, so briefly I'll tell you like what all the teams will be involved, but we'll catch up in the next class to discuss all this about all the teams in detail. Okay, so the various teams that gets involved are sponsors team, protocol team, CRF design team, site management team, clinical data management team, data analysis team, medical writing team. Okay, so I mean, here I have outlined the teams. Okay, and again within each team there may be sub teams, okay, existing, and there will be different titles that will be given to each person, okay, working in that team. So we will not be going into all that. Okay, so I just have outlined the teams that will be involved in a clinical project, and briefly we will be discussing about each team and the team where we will be working in that whole pipeline. Okay, we will be discussing in detail. So when it comes to our part, I mean, a SAS programmers part, we'll discuss in detail, and the other teams will be discussing briefly. Okay, to for you to have an idea, right? Okay. Yep. So for today, we'll hold the session here. Okay, and we'll catch up in the tomorrow's class.